Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. This small ritual of orientation, of acknowledging one's place in time and space, matters more than it seems. We're about to descend into the hidden worlds of H.P. Lovecraft, a writer who turned geography itself into a form of revelation. His stories are not merely tales of horror, but maps of forgotten civilizations, inscriptions of knowledge that humanity was never meant to recover. To trace these worlds is to wander through the archaeology of the human imagination, where myth and science, dream and history converge into something deeply unsettling. In the early decades of the 20th century, while explorers charted the last unclaimed regions of the globe, Lovecraft charted the last unexamined depths of the mind. His fiction mirrors the intellectual anxieties of his time: Darwinian descent, Freud's unconscious, Einstein's relativistic void. Yet his true project was neither scientific nor supernatural. It was ontological. He asked what happens when civilization, so proud of its rational architecture, uncovers the ruins beneath its own foundations. Consider carefully what that implies. Every age builds upon the bones of another, and each discovery carries the echo of something more ancient still. This documentary will proceed as an inquiry, part literary, part historical, part philosophical, into those buried strata. We will follow Lovecraft's footsteps through lost continents, forbidden texts, and civilizations older than memory. The deeper we go, the more we will find that the hidden world is not beneath us, but within us, waiting patiently to be unearthed. To understand Lovecraft's vision of hidden worlds, those lost civilizations buried beneath sand, sea, and sanity itself, we must first examine the personal and historical terrain in which he labored. Born in 1890 and shaped by the twilight of the Victorian era, Howard Phillips Lovecraft entered a world that still believed, or pretended to believe, that reason could chart the unknown. Providence, Rhode Island, his lifelong sanctuary and imaginative crucible, was a city steeped in colonial memory, decaying grandeur, and Gothic architecture. It offered him not only the aesthetic palette of the past, but a physical metaphor for the sedimentary nature of time. Even as the modern world encroached, Lovecraft retreated, philosophically, emotionally, and creatively, into older modes of being. The ruins he would later describe in Antarctica or Arabia were prefigured in the moss-covered headstones and shadowed libraries of New England. Yet his project was not mere nostalgia. It was reconstruction, an attempt to resurrect the pre-human past and embed it within the geological, psychic, and mythic layers of his fictional universe. This literary archaeology emerged alongside real-world developments. The early 20th century witnessed an unprecedented wave of archaeological discovery: the excavation of the Valley of the Kings, 1922, the decoding of ancient Sumerian myths, and the popularization of Atlantis theories by figures like Ignatius Donnelly. Each new find shifted public consciousness toward the idea that beneath history lay prehistory, and beneath prehistory, something older still. Lovecraft, though skeptical of the occult, absorbed these revelations and recontextualized them. In his hands, archaeology became dangerous, not a pursuit of truth, but a flirtation with oblivion. In At the Mountains of Madness, 1936, the discovery of the Elder Things city is presented with the tone of scientific triumph, only to disintegrate into existential horror as deeper truths are unearthed. This pattern recurs throughout his work. Discoverers do not find treasure. They uncover foundations that humanity was not meant to build upon. Civilization, in this paradigm, is not a triumph over chaos, but a fragile layer hiding it. We must recognize that Lovecraft's personal contradictions are central to understanding his narrative method. Publicly a rationalist and materialist, he denounced spiritualism, religion, and superstition. Lovecraft privately entertained profound metaphysical anxieties. His letters reveal a man gripped by fears of hereditary madness, racial degeneration, and cosmic purposelessness. These fears were not idle. They became the psychological clay from which his hidden worlds were shaped. In place of traditional deities, Lovecraft imagined the great old ones, immense alien entities whose mere existence destabilizes sanity. His stories function as case studies and forbidden inquiry. Characters seek truth, uncover hidden structures, cities, books, memories, and are transformed or destroyed by the revelation. The structure is recursive. The deeper one digs, whether literally or symbolically, the more one finds that the human story is but a recent inscription on an older, unreadable stone. It is not a coincidence that his protagonists are often scholars, archaeologists, or linguists. These are Lovecraft's avatars, caught between the drive to know and the terror of knowing too much. Consider carefully how Lovecraft transforms the scholarly impulse into a tragic flaw. In conventional horror, the monster is outside, the threat physical. In Lovecraft, the monster is knowledge itself. The act of uncovering is not merely dangerous, it is metaphysically corrosive. The past is not dead, it is sleeping, waiting to be unearthed. The irony is profound. Lovecraft's characters are often doomed not by the malice of ancient beings, but by their own compulsion to investigate. In The Shadow Out of Time, 1936, the protagonist Peasley rediscovers a buried alien civilization not through supernatural means, but through academic research and archaeological fieldwork. His ultimate revelation, that his consciousness was once exchanged with that of a Yithian, is reached through evidence, logic, and methodical inquiry. But the implication is shattering. Memory, identity, and time itself are no longer secure. The scholar becomes the site of ontological collapse. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's method. He weaponizes rationality against itself, turning the tools of enlightenment into instruments of horror. Lovecraft's mythic world is built on the premise that civilization is a thin crust overlaid upon a seething core of unknowable time. It is not simply that these hidden worlds exist, they persist. Ruins are not relics, they are structures still inhabited, in dreams or in reality, by inhuman minds. This circular return, the past erupting into the present, the buried coming to light, haunts every layer of his fiction. His characters are often haunted by dreams of distant cities or strange rituals, suggesting that these hidden civilizations are not just historical, but somehow psychic. The Nameless City, 1921, one of Lovecraft's earliest forays into subterranean horror, evokes this directly. That is not dead which can eternal lie. It is not simply death that is deferred, but time itself. The dead civilizations of Lovecraft are not past, they are latent. Their discovery is not a linear journey forward, but a spiral downward. Not progression, but regression. Not revelation, but recursion. We must pause here to acknowledge the political and ideological sediments embedded in these buried worlds. Lovecraft's own worldview was steeped in anxieties over modernity, immigration, and perceived cultural decline. His depiction of hidden civilizations often reflects these fears, frequently coded in terms of racial degeneration or hybrid monstrosity. The deep ones of The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1936, are not only aquatic horrors, they are metaphors for cultural miscegenation and biological corruption. Likewise, the ancient cities in The Mound, 1940, and The Rats in the Walls, 1924, hint at pre-human races and cannibalistic legacies that infect the present. These elements must be interrogated, not excused. Lovecraft's xenophobia is not incidental. It shapes the symbolic logic of his hidden worlds. Yet there is a paradox. Even as his fear of the other manifests in these constructions, the horror of the stories lies in the recognition that the other was always within. That which we buried, historically, culturally, biologically, was never truly separate. It was simply dormant. To understand Lovecraft's obsession with buried civilizations and the secret architectures of forgotten time, we must travel backward, not merely to his personal history, but further still, to the subterranean currents of Western thought that shaped his literary cosmos. Lovecraft did not invent the concept of hidden worlds. He inherited it from a long tradition of thinkers, dreamers, and myth-makers who sought origins not in the future, but in the ruins of time. His fiction operates within a lineage that includes romantic ruin poetry, theosophical esoterica, colonial anthropology, and 19th century scientific speculation. These strands converge into a worldview in which the past is never past, where time is not linear but stratified, and where knowledge leads not to illumination but to disintegration. It is not simply that Lovecraft read deeply, it is that he read too deeply, and in doing so absorbed the subterranean ideologies embedded within the texts themselves. One of the earliest and most persistent cultural motifs Lovecraft draws upon is the romantic fascination with ruins. In the early 19th century, poets like Shelley and Byron wandered amidst the decaying remnants of empires, imagining past glories fallen into sublime decay. Ruins became more than architectural features. They became philosophical provocations. Percy Shelley's Ozymandias, 1818, stands as a concise monument to this idea, that all human striving ends in sand, and that time erodes even the most tyrannical grandeur. Lovecraft inherits this sensibility, but infuses it with horror. In his stories, ruins do not simply mark the past, they contain it. They are not dead, they are dormant. In the nameless city and the call of Cthulhu, ancient stonework breathes, dreams, and remembers. The collapse of a civilization is not its end, but its concealment, and archaeology becomes a form of awakening. Where the romantic saw melancholy beauty, Lovecraft sees latent terror. Yet this aesthetic of decay is only one layer of the foundation. More insidious is the influence of 19th century occult revivalism, particularly the writings of Helena Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society. In works like The Secret Doctrine, 1888, Blavatsky posited a pseudo-historical narrative of root races, sunken continents, Lemuria, Atlantis, and cosmic cycles. These texts blend mythology, esotericism, and speculative anthropology into a vision of spiritual prehistory that seduced generations of readers. Lovecraft was skeptical of their metaphysics, but deeply influenced by their structure. The idea of pre-human civilizations possessing arcane knowledge, of history as a sequence of cataclysms and rebirths, echoes throughout his mythos. Consider carefully what this implies. Lovecraft's use of fictitious tomes, like the Necronomicon or panacotic manuscripts mirrors the occult strategy of veiling fiction as revealed truth. He did not parody these traditions so much as adopt their mechanisms, replacing their mysticism with cosmic indifference. It is not merely spiritual esoterica that shaped Lovecraft's vision, but philosophical pessimism. Thinkers like Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche, though never explicitly cited in his fiction, haunt the epistemic atmosphere of his work. Schopenhauer's vision of a blind, impersonal will, one that lies beneath all conscious striving, parallels Lovecraft's great old ones, massive, unconscious forces that shape reality without caring for it. Nietzsche's eternal recurrence and critique of metaphysical truth echo in Lovecraft's cyclical time and unknowable cosmology. The suggestion is clear. Meaning is a human invention, fragile and ultimately insufficient. The cosmos does not speak in moral categories. It roars in equations, in geological strata, in the folds of forgotten time. It is not simply that humanity is insignificant. It is that significance itself is a temporary illusion, a defense mechanism against the crushing awareness of scale and time. We must also examine the anthropological gaze of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which Lovecraft absorbed and distorted. During this period, Western scholars were cataloging so-called primitive cultures, often through a lens of evolutionary hierarchy. Texts such as Fraser's The Golden Bough, 1890, and the early ethnographies of the time-framed ancient rituals and belief systems as survivals of an earlier mental state. Lovecraft was fascinated by these accounts, particularly their treatment of myth as a degraded form of knowledge. His vision of hidden worlds often involves degenerate cults, groups that have preserved fragments of forbidden truth through ritual and dream. The Call of Cthulhu exemplifies this, a global network of worshippers derided as mod or savage is revealed to be in contact with cosmic reality. This inversion is unsettling. What academia dismissed as delusion, Lovecraft repurposes as revelation. The anthropology of his stories is recursive. The more one studies the primitive, the more one glimpses the pre-human, the alien. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's underlying philosophy. The very act of interpretation is treacherous. Knowledge is stratified, not in the sense of progress, but of burial. Each layer of understanding conceals another, deeper, more ancient layer, until meaning itself becomes unstable. It is not a coincidence that his characters so often confront palimpsests, ancient texts rewritten, cities built upon older ruins, dreams echoing forgotten lives. In The Shadow Out of Time, the Yithian civilization records all knowledge in vast subterranean libraries, but even this is ultimately futile. Time erases everything, or worse, it preserves it imperfectly, allowing fragments to contaminate the present. The past is not a stable archive, it is a leaking wound, and the scholar is not a surgeon, but an infected host. Here we see the philosophical implication most clearly. Epistemology itself becomes a source of horror. In Lovecraft's fictional universe, language does more than convey meaning. It carries contagion. It functions as a threshold between the human and the inhuman, between sense and secrecy. Words in his stories are not merely signifiers. They are fragments of ancient codes, echoes of long-dead tongues, and corrupt transmissions from alien minds. To read them is to risk unraveling one's own cognitive boundaries. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft's linguistic strategy is not rooted in clarity or coherence, but in symbolic fracture. He deliberately constructs a lexicon that mimics the structure of dream, ruin, and myth, impressionistic, phonetically jarring, resistant to interpretation. Through invented names, distorted etymologies, and fragmentary citations, he simulates the very act of encountering a language that predates and possibly predetermines human thought. At the center of this strategy lies the phonetic grotesque. Names such as Cthulhu, Yhanthle, and Azathoth do not resemble known linguistic families. They are meant to evoke alien articulation, consonant clusters, and glottal stops that strain against the reader's phonological expectations. Lovecraft himself described Cthulhu as only a crude approximation of an unpronounceable alien syllable, suggesting it should be vocalized with a kind of throaty klul-hlu. This is not an aesthetic gimmick, but a philosophical gesture. If language reflects the structure of thought, then these names imply thoughts that cannot be human. They are not names in the conventional sense. They are verbal relics from non-Euclidean consciousness. This usage disrupts the reader's linguistic map, severing the tether between word and meaning. It is not that we cannot understand the language. It is that the language refuses to be understood. Lovecraft extends this dislocation through his fictional grimoires and sacred texts, most notably the Necronomicon. Unlike traditional literary texts, which offer meaning through structured exposition, the Necronomicon functions as a symbolic artifact, a document that resists interpretation even as it compels it. It is referenced across numerous stories, but never fully quoted, allowing it to accumulate significance through absence. Its supposed author, the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, becomes a cipher, half historian, half prophet, wholly unreliable. This strategy mirrors the occult texts of the real world, such as the Key of Solomon or the Book of Enoch, which are often known more through rumor and citation than direct reading. But Lovecraft goes further. The Necronomicon is not merely forbidden because of its content, but because its language changes the reader. In The Dunwich Horror, 1929, the text is used to summon transdimensional forces. In The Hound, 1924, it evokes ancient rites. The implication is clear. Language here is not symbolic, but operative. To read is to invoke. To understand is to be undone. We must recognize the deep structural irony in Lovecraft's linguistic approach. While he constructs languages that deny translation, he also mimics the apparatus of academic study. His stories include citations, invented scholars, marginal notes, and pseudo-linguistic analysis. This duality between impenetrability and scholarly formality creates a destabilizing tension. In The Call of Cthulhu, the narrator compiles a dossier of newspaper clippings, personal letters, and eyewitness accounts, all of which circle around an indecipherable cult chant. Fenglui Mugulwanaf, Cthulhu, Rulia, Ugahnagel, Ftagen. The syntax resists parsing, but the repetition and rhythm give it the aura of a liturgical invocation. The story's horror lies not in the meaning of the chant, but in its capacity to harmonize disparate witnesses across cultures and time. Language here acts as a mnemonic virus, propagating through dreams, rituals, and texts. It does not transmit information, it summons memory, both personal and civilizational. Lovecraft's fascination with language also extends into his deeper mythic chronology. The Narcotic Manuscripts, the Book of Aben, and the Unersprechlichen Quoten are all texts that predate or transcend humanity. Their names suggest ancient linguistic roots, Greek, German, Latin, yet their contents defy scholarly discipline. This deliberate mingling of linguistic familiarity with conceptual opacity, allows Lovecraft to simulate authenticity while preserving mystery. It is not simply that these books exist within his fiction, it is that they anchor it. They serve as linguistic fossils, evidence of a literary ecosystem that once flourished and now haunts the present. In this sense, his languages function much like the ruins in his stories. They point to civilizations and epistemologies that no longer make sense to the modern mind. The alphabet is intact, but the grammar is gone. What emerges then is a vision of language as both tool and trap. It allows access to knowledge, but also guarantees its distortion. The further one goes in attempting to decode Lovecraft's symbolic systems, the more one realizes that the systems are designed to resist comprehension. This mirrors the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein's late observation, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. But Lovecraft inverts this. Where silence would be prudent, his characters speak, and in doing so, summon what should not be named. The horror lies in articulation itself. When knowledge becomes unspeakable, language becomes a kind of heresy. And yet, it is precisely through language, scraps of glyph, chants in dreams, inscriptions on buried walls, that the hidden world reveals itself. It is not merely forbidden knowledge, but forbidden grammar. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's metaphysical design. His etymologies, invented or distorted, enact the very process they describe. They function not just as narrative details, but as philosophical assertions that reality is fundamentally resistant to representation, that truth exists beyond the structure of human language, and that to approach it is to collapse into paradox. The Necronomicon is not dangerous because of what it says, but because it says anything at all. In the same way, names like Cthulhu and Azathoth do not point to coherent entities, but to zones of ontological instability. Their sound alone is enough to rupture sanity. As we move forward, we will see how these symbols become embedded within narrative form itself, how Lovecraft constructs authenticity, not through plot, but through myth-making techniques that mimic real-world historical transmission. Language, in his hands, is only the first gate. The next is belief. In Lovecraft's cosmos, the hidden world does not merely exist within the ruins of ancient cities or beneath the waves of forgotten oceans. It also resides in the margins of texts, in the footnotes of invented treatises, and in the authoritative tone of fictional academics. His genius lies not just in the creation of monsters or alien gods, but in the simulation of a literary archive so convincing, so internally coherent, that readers begin to feel as though they are uncovering history, not fiction. Unlike typical storytelling, which seeks to immerse the reader in action or character, Lovecraft employs the aesthetic of documentation. His stories read like field reports, expedition logs, or declassified government files. This technique achieves something rare in fiction. It blurs the line between narrative and historical record, and in doing so, it transforms his mythos from fiction into belief system, not in the sense of religion, but in the form of an imagined scholarly tradition, complete with sources, commentaries, and buried contradictions. Consider carefully how this technique functions in The Call of Cthulhu, 1928, perhaps the most structurally revealing of Lovecraft's tales. The story is presented as a document compiled by Francis Wayland Thurston, who inherits a box of materials from his deceased uncle, a professor of Semitic languages. The story unfolds not through direct experience, but through the collation of newspaper clippings, personal letters, field notes, and interviews. Each artifact adds a layer of credibility. The cumulative effect is that the narrative does not feel told, but discovered. Lovecraft leverages this documentary realism to suggest a broader world beyond the story's frame, a world where the Necronomicon circulates in rare manuscript form, where scholars cross-reference each other's findings, and where the uncanny seeps into the rational frameworks of academia. The horror comes not from the monstrous entity itself, but from the dawning realization that it has already been documented. In other words, Cthulhu doesn't just haunt the world, he haunts the archives. This mode of myth building is not unique to Lovecraft, but he refines it with unsettling precision. In traditional mythologies, Greek, Norse, Mesopotamian, the stories evolve across centuries, shaped by oral traditions and religious ritual. Lovecraft short-circuits that timeline. He fabricates mythic depth by constructing stories that cite one another, creating the illusion of an intertextual network. At the Mountains of Madness references the Necronomicon and the Elder Things, both of which appear in earlier stories. The Dunwich Horror includes direct quotations from the Necronomicon, attributing them to the fictional Abdul al-Hazred. Even more compelling is the inclusion of invented academic institutions, Miskatonic University, the Armitage Collection, the Dyer Papers. These entities reinforce the illusion that Lovecraft's world is underpinned by systematic inquiry. This is not merely world building, it is world documenting, and like any archive, it is selective, fragmented, and self-referential. The mythos emerges not as a divine revelation, but as a messy, terrifying accumulation of partial truths. We must recognize the philosophical weight of this narrative strategy. Lovecraft's false archive enacts the very concept it dramatizes, that knowledge is always mediated, always partial, and often unreliable. His fictional scholars are rarely witnesses. They are compilers, interpreters, and annotators. They work from damaged texts, incomplete data, and contradictory sources. In The Shadow Out of Time, 1936, the narrator reconstructs his experience of psychic time travel, not through memory, but through archaeological discovery. His verification comes from a buried city whose inscriptions match his dream impressions. But this confirmation is double-edged. It validates the nightmare, but also severs the boundary between imagination and history. The reader is left in a liminal space, uncertain whether they are encountering fiction or forgotten truth. And this is Lovecraft's ultimate manipulation, not the invention of a myth, but the simulation of a scholarly process that makes the myth feel real. Not X, but Y. It is not simply that Lovecraft created monsters, but that he created the illusion of scholarly consensus about them. His stories are filled with invented researchers, Dr. Armitage, Professor Dyer, Inspector Legras, each contributing a piece to the puzzle. They form a fictional academic community whose purpose is not to defeat the cosmic threat, but to document its influence. This reframing is critical. Unlike traditional heroes who vanquish evil, Lovecraft's protagonists are archivists of the inevitable. They catalogue the unthinkable. They footnote the abyss. This inversion of heroic structure reinforces Lovecraft's central theme, that knowledge, no matter how rigorously pursued, does not lead to mastery, but to collapse. His characters do not conquer the unknown, they authenticate it, sealing their fate by affirming its reality. This technique resonates powerfully with the broader cultural moment in which Lovecraft wrote. The early 20th century was an age of institutional faith, of encyclopedias, scholarly journals, and museums asserting their authority as custodians of knowledge. Lovecraft mimics this apparatus, but subtly subverts it. His stories reflect a world where everything has already been written, where all that remains is interpretation, but the act of interpretation becomes fatal. Just as the archaeologist in the nameless city descends into subterranean tunnels and finds more than he expected, the reader descends through Lovecraft's texts only to find themselves implicated. The archive is not passive, it is recursive. The more you read, the more you awaken what should remain buried. This mirrors the experience of conspiracy theories, where each document points to another, and the act of researching becomes indistinguishable from the act of believing. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's theory of myth. Unlike classical mythology, which explains the cosmos through symbolic narrative, Lovecraftian myth does not explain. It destabilizes. It strips away anthropocentric meaning and replaces it with ontological vertigo. The mythos is not a closed system, but an open wound. It bleeds into other stories, imitates academic discourse, and infects reader consciousness. And crucially, it demands participation. To follow the references, to recognize the names, to trace the texts, is to become part of the myth-making process. The hidden world is not revealed through prophecy or divine voice, but through footnotes, marginalia, and correspondence. It is not shouted, but whispered, and once heard, it cannot be unheard. At the core of Lovecraft's mythos lies a philosophical structure so alien to traditional horror, and indeed to traditional literature, that it often resists immediate recognition. This structure is founded not on moral threat or supernatural retribution, but on cosmic indifference. Lovecraft does not posit a universe that is hostile to humanity, but rather one that is utterly unconcerned with it. This distinction is crucial. In conventional horror, the antagonist sees, hunts, punishes. In Lovecraft, the antagonist is often unaware, or worse, unknowing. The horror stems not from persecution, but from oblivion. The most merciful thing in the world, Lovecraft writes in The Call of Cthulhu, 1928, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. This sentence, often cited, is not merely thematic, it is programmatic. It suggests that knowledge itself is dangerous, not because of what it reveals, but because of what it confirms, that we are incidental, that our understanding was never requested, never accounted for, and never complete. This theme of insignificance pervades Lovecraft's stories. In The Whisperer in Darkness, 1931, the Mygo are not demons or monsters in the traditional sense. They are alien scientists with no interest in humanity's welfare or morality. Their capacity to extract and transport human brains in metal cylinders is described with clinical detachment, devoid of sadism or empathy. The terror lies in the realization that humanity is not central, but peripheral, a raw material in an older, larger project. Similarly, The Color Out of Space, 1927, presents a cosmic entity that is not malevolent, but simply incompatible with terrestrial life. The narrator cannot even fully describe the creature's color, noting it only as an unnatural shade never before seen. The breakdown of language here signals a deeper breakdown, a confrontation with phenomena for which human consciousness was never evolved. Lovecraft's characters often arrive at this point, not through trauma, but through analysis. the closer they approach truth, the more they are displaced from the narrative of the cosmos. We must recognize that entropy in Lovecraft is not merely thermodynamic decay, but epistemic collapse. Knowledge itself deteriorates. In At the Mountains of Madness, 1936, the explorers initially believe they have uncovered the remains of a long-extinct alien race. Their confidence in geology, paleontology, and linguistic analysis begins as a triumph of human rationality. But as the city reveals its secrets, their classifications fail. The elder things are not extinct, and the Shoggoths, creatures they created, have outlived them. What begins as scientific taxonomy devolves into narrative disintegration. This is not the death of knowledge, but its transmutation into meaninglessness. The implication is chilling. Progress is a false construct. The more we learn, the less coherent our understanding becomes. In Lovecraft's universe, entropy is not just a cosmic force, it is a cognitive condition. This idea is reinforced through Lovecraft's frequent use of dreams as ontological instability. Unlike Freud or Jung, who saw dreams as symbolic reflections of inner truth, Lovecraft reimagines them as transdimensional communications, leaks from other timelines, races, and planes of existence. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, written 1927, published posthumously, Randolph Carter traverses the Dreamlands, an alternate realm of ancient cities, inhuman gods, and shifting geography. The Dreamlands are not fantasy. They are a counter-historical archive, preserving entities and cultures long extinct in waking reality. Carter's journey is less a heroic odyssey than a descent into the unreliability of perception itself. He learns that his deepest desire, access to a beautiful city from his dreams, leads not to peace, but to confrontation with Nyarlathotep, the chaotic messenger of the gods. Here, dreams are not wish fulfillment, they are ontological traps. They dissolve the boundary between subjective and objective, and in doing so, render both unstable. It is not simply that Lovecraft's characters dream, but that the structure of dreaming becomes his metaphor for cognition. Dreams are layered, recursive, and disobedient to time. They echo and transform, like myth, like memory. In The Shadow Out of Time, Professor Peaslee believes he has suffered amnesia, only to discover that his consciousness was temporally displaced into the body of a Yithian, a member of a race capable of exchanging minds across epochs. His dreams are not memories. They are invasive transmissions. Lovecraft weaponizes this structure to suggest that human consciousness is already penetrated by the alien. The hidden world is not simply outside of us. It thinks through us. The implication is radical, that thought itself may be a colonial space, already occupied by older intelligences, not knowledge, but disintegration, not awakening, but forgetting. This reversal is key. Lovecraft reconfigures familiar philosophical tropes, like Plato's cave or Descartes' doubt, and turns them against their own conclusions. Enlightenment does not bring liberation, it brings collapse. The philosopher in Lovecraft is no different from the madman. Both are witnesses to the unthinkable. In this way, Lovecraft anticipates post-structuralist thinkers like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, who also questioned the foundations of knowledge and the integrity of language. But where Derrida deconstructs texts, Lovecraft deconstructs reality. His fictions posit a world where logic holds only within narrow human parameters, and those parameters are already disintegrating. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's metaphysical design. He constructs horror not through gore or violence, but through the erosion of coherence. His stories are diagrams of collapse, blueprints of the mind undoing itself under the weight of its own discoveries. The cosmos is not evil, it is vast, and vastness, when truly grasped, is intolerable. Human sanity, he suggests, is not a stable default, but a cultural adaptation, useful but contingent. It is a narrative we tell ourselves to survive the silence of the stars. In Lovecraft's hidden words, that silence is broken, but what we hear is not music, not meaning, not even menace. It is noise, too ancient to name, too vast to bear, and already inside us. If Lovecraft's core philosophical concepts, insignificance, entropy, dream reality, form the skeleton of his mythos, then the entities that inhabit it are its pulsating organs. These creatures are not merely monsters, they are ontological symbols. They do not threaten humanity by design, but by proximity. Their mere existence unravels the cognitive architecture upon which human meaning depends. And crucially, they are not personifications of fear, sin, or death in the way traditional supernatural beings are. They are not metaphors for evil, but refutations of anthropocentrism. As Lovecraft wrote in a 1934 letter, "The gods of my tales are not supernatural in the ordinary sense, for they are not primarily concerned with mankind. To them, there are no human beings." This statement is not an aside. It is a declaration of philosophical orientation. The beings of the mythos operate on cosmic scales of time, dimension, and form. They are not antagonists in a story. They are errors in the story itself. Foremost among these beings is Cthulhu, whose form and function have become synonymous with Lovecraftian horror. First introduced in The Call of Cthulhu, 1928, Cthulhu is described as an immense, tentacled figure with a vaguely humanoid shape, an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature. A pulpy, tentacled head surmounted a grotesque, scaly body. Yet even this description is admitted to be a simplification. The horror does not lie in the details, but in the admission that no full description can be accurate. Cthulhu sleeps in R'lyeh, a submerged city of non-Euclidean geometry, dreaming, influencing minds, awaiting alignment. The key point is this: Cthulhu is not dead, but dormant. He waits. His awakening is not an act of volition, but of cosmic timing. His cult does not serve him in exchange for power, but to maintain alignment with his indifferent rhythm. Not faith, but resonance. Not purpose, but pattern. Next, we must consider the elder things introduced in At the Mountains of Madness, 1936, as perhaps the most detailed alien race in Lovecraft's corpus. These barrel-shaped, starfish-headed beings built the first cities on Earth long before humanity existed. They are described biologically, almost lovingly, in academic detail: 5-limbed radial symmetry, reproductive spores, advanced tool use. The story unfolds through scientific observation, even as the horror intensifies. The most profound moment occurs not when the beings attack, but when the narrator discovers their murals. Depictions of their civilization's rise, technological prowess, and eventual rebellion of their own creations, the amorphous Shoggoths. The elder things are not villains. They are former masters of Earth, now degraded and forgotten. They are evolutionary relics who once knew purpose, but now survive as shadows in the ice. Here, Lovecraft literalizes his philosophy. Even the gods have ruins. Even their originators fall prey to entropy. We must pause here to examine the great race of Yith, featured in The Shadow Out of Time, 1936. Unlike the biologically grotesque Cthulhu or the ancient Elder Things, the Yithians' horror lies in their mental capabilities. They possess the power to switch minds across time and space, temporarily displacing human consciousness into alien bodies and vice versa. This form of invasion is subtle. It leaves no scars, only unexplainable knowledge and nightmares. The story's narrator slowly realizes he has been inhabited by a Yithian who used his body as a recording device while he occupied a different form in Earth's distant past. This being is terrifying, not because it is cruel, but because it is indifferent to consent. Thought itself becomes a terrain of colonization. Consider carefully what this implies. In Lovecraft, identity is no refuge. Memory is not private. Even the mind is part of the cosmos, and just as vulnerable to intrusion. Then there is Nyarlathotep, perhaps the most disturbing figure in Lovecraft's pantheon, precisely because he breaks the pattern. First introduced in the prose poem Nyarlathotep, 1920. This entity differs from the other cosmic beings in that he interacts directly with humanity. He walks the earth in human form, performs miracles, spreads madness through technology, dream, and spectacle. Unlike Cthulhu, he does not sleep. Unlike the Yithians, he does not hide. He is described as the crawling chaos, and he serves as a kind of ambassador of entropy. But even his function is ambiguous. Sometimes he appears as a trickster, other times as a herald. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, he plays the role of gatekeeper to ultimate knowledge and ultimate dissolution. What makes Nyarlathotep so unnerving is not his malevolence, but his familiarity. He speaks our language. He wears our face. He represents the horror of recognizing that the collapse has already begun and that it speaks with your voice. Beyond these central figures, Lovecraft populates his dreamlands with entities whose logic defies biology or physics. Creatures like Zoogs, night gaunts, and moon beasts do not follow natural laws. They follow mythic logic. They are metaphors made flesh, dream stuff given structure. Yet even these beings are often governed by their own strange hierarchies, suggesting that the hidden world, while terrifying, is also deeply ordered, just not by human categories. The gods of the dreamlands, such as Nodens, Hypnos, and the faceless Nyarlathotep, exist within a cosmology that resembles ancient myth, but feels far older. Here, we do not find divine punishment or reward, but cosmic recurrence. These entities are part of a repeating metaphysical architecture where dreams are not escapes from reality, but roots back into older layers of it. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's treatment of monstrous entities. They are not designed to frighten in the way that vampires or werewolves do, with their threats to life and morality. Rather, they are fragments of a deeper structure, symbols of time's indifference, of form's instability, of mind's vulnerability. They function as philosophical proofs by contradiction. The more the human characters attempt to describe, categorize, or understand these entities, the more the stories spiral into incoherence. That is not failure. It is design. Lovecraft's creatures embody his central claim that the universe is not constructed for us, and to believe otherwise is to court madness. Lovecraft's stories are rarely about creatures in the traditional sense. More often, they are about encounter, the moment when a human mind brushes against the incomprehensible and fractures beneath its weight. The central drama is not a battle, but a cognitive collapse. Horror in Lovecraft is psychological, not emotional, epistemic. not ethical. Characters do not go mad because they are weak or unstable, but because they are exposed. Madness in Lovecraft is not pathology. It is testimony. It is the one proof the rational mind can offer that it has glimpsed something beyond its own design. This reveals something profound. Lovecraft treats madness not as deviation, but as transformation. The scholar, the explorer, the linguist, these are not mere protagonists. They are conduits, and their unraveling is how the hidden world speaks. Consider Professor Armitage in The Dunwich Horror, 1929. A man of books, reason, and quiet authority, Armitage represents the archetype of Lovecraft's intellectual, firm in belief, but vulnerable to discovery. His confrontation with the half-human offspring of Yog-Sothoth is not merely physical, but symbolic. Through ancient tomes, archaic rituals, and fragments of lost language, Armitage assembles a picture of a world that should not be, but clearly is. His response is not fear, but urgency, a desperate attempt to contain the knowledge before it spreads. In this story, madness is both threat and shield. Those outside the academic circle cannot comprehend the event, and those within can barely survive it. The interaction with the alien is indirect, textual, secondhand, but it is enough. It destabilizes certainty. Armitage remains sane by narrative's end, but the reader cannot help but wonder if sanity in this world is anything more than disciplined denial. We must pause here to consider the role of dreams in this descent. In Lovecraft's stories, dreams are never private. They are not symbolic, but communicative. In The Call of Cthulhu, the artist Wilcox suffers from disturbing visions that align with global disturbances and ancient rites. These are not hallucinations, they are transmissions. The text makes clear that sensitive minds around the world are experiencing the same visions, all coordinated by Cthulhu's stirring in his slumber. The implication is devastating. The boundary between mind and cosmos has eroded. What we call madness may simply be attunement, a state in which the mind becomes vulnerable to frequencies older than biology. The sensitive artist is not mad in the clinical sense. He is receiving. This aligns with Lovecraft's consistent theme that the self is not sealed, but porous. Madness is not illness. It is interference. This interference is especially evident in The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1936, a story that reverses the usual arc of descent. Here, the narrator uncovers a hidden society of hybrid beings, descendants of humans and deep ones, who worship the undersea deity Dagon. At first, the horror appears racialized, even xenophobic, as the narrator recoils from miscegenation and decay. But the final twist renders the narrative far more unsettling. The narrator himself is of Innsmouth blood. The horror is not the other, but the self. The hidden world is not beneath the sea, but within his genes. And madness, in this case, is not breakdown, but acceptance. He embraces his transformation, swimming out to sea to join his ancestral race. This story complicates the usual function of madness. It becomes a form of awakening, a shedding of the human mask in favor of something more ancient. Not alienation, but inheritance. Lovecraft frequently blurs the distinction between mental illness and revelation. In The Shadow Out of Time, 1936, Professor Peaslee suffers what appears to be amnesia and dissociation, only to discover that his consciousness was replaced by a being from the great race of Yith. The terror lies not in being crazy, but in being correct. His dreams fragmented recollections, and historical fascinations all point toward an impossible but coherent narrative. He was not mad, he was possessed. But what does that imply for the diagnosis of madness in general? Lovecraft suggests that the human mind, when exposed to true cosmic history, cannot sustain its normal functioning. Insanity becomes a sign of exposure. This reveals something essential. Madness, in Lovecraft, is not a narrative punishment. It is a philosophical consequence. It is not that his characters lose their minds. It is that their minds are no longer suitable containers for what they now know. We must recognize how deeply Lovecraft links madness to language and reading. His stories often revolve around manuscripts, glyphs, inscriptions, texts that defy interpretation or undo the reader. In The Rats in the Walls, 1924, the narrator discovers that his ancestral home was built over a vast underground city used for cannibalistic rites. His descent into madness is triggered by both physical discovery and linguistic contamination. He begins to speak in a dead language, one he never studied, but somehow remembers. This circular collapse, where knowledge infects language and language rewires thought, is central to Lovecraft's horror. To read is to remember. To remember is to invite possession. And possession in Lovecraft's universe is always collective. Madness is never isolated. It spreads through texts, dreams, and bloodlines. It is not simply a personal failure, but a symptom of something larger pushing in. This reveals something profound. Lovecraft's conception of madness is not about losing contact with reality, but about realizing what reality has always been. The sane mind filters, edits, explains away. The mad mind sees clearly and is destroyed by the sight. This inversion is central to the mythos. Sanity is a shelter built from fictions. Madness is a window. And once you look through it, the landscape shifts. The stars become symbols. The past returns, and the self unravels. Lovecraft does not warn us against madness. He describes it. He maps its contours, traces its causes, and leaves us with the disquieting possibility that madness is the price of truth. At the heart of Lovecraft's universe lies a paradox, that knowledge, long heralded as humanity's tool of progress, is also its most potent poison. His stories present information not as a pathway to empowerment, but as a gateway to disintegration. Forbidden knowledge in the Lovecraftian mythos is not merely prescribed because it is dangerous, but because it undoes the mind that receives it. The threat is not of moral transgression, but of epistemic implosion. The very act of knowing becomes an existential risk. In The Call of Cthulhu, the narrator warns that someday the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein. This is not a caution against curiosity, it is a eulogy for it. Once the pieces are joined, the whole cannot be unseen. And what it reveals is not horror in the traditional sense, but a cosmic mismatch between the structure of reality and the mind evolved to survive it. The central symbol of this knowledge is the Necronomicon, a fictional grimoire whose existence has outpaced its fictional origin. Penned, allegedly, by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, this text functions as a kind of philosophical black hole. It is not a book of spells, but a monument to ontological breakdown. Every reference to it, across stories like The Dunwich Horror, The Whisperer in Darkness, and At the Mountains of Madness, emphasizes its incompleteness, its danger, and its recursive contamination. One does not read the Necronomicon and learn. One reads and becomes destabilized. In the Dunwich Horror, the book is instrumental in summoning and resisting Yog-Sothoth, but the price of its use is mental erosion. The reader gains access to truths not designed for human minds, and in doing so, steps outside the protective constraints of reality. Not enlightenment, but epistemic exposure. We must pause here to examine how Lovecraft frames this knowledge, not as revelation, but as intrusion. His stories often begin with rational inquiry. An archaeologist digs, a scholar translates, a scientist measures, but these actions always trigger a rupture. In The Dreams in the Witch House, 1933, the protagonist's study of non-Euclidean geometry and folklore leads him to a convergence point where mathematics and myth fuse. The result is not discovery, but invasion. He dreams of strange geometries and finds himself in alien dimensions where witches and ancient entities like Nyarlathotep conduct rituals that transcend time and space. Here, knowledge opens a literal portal, but unlike in heroic fantasy, the hero does not gain wisdom or power. He becomes unmoored. Reality does not expand, it fractures. The human mind, Lovecraft suggests, is a closed system. Knowledge is not additive, but corrosive. The more you learn, the less you can remain what you were. This theme finds its most explicit treatment in From Beyond, 1934, a short but devastating story in which a scientist invents a machine that stimulates the pineal gland, allowing users to perceive overlapping dimensions. These otherworldly creatures exist alongside us at all times, unseen only because our biological filters protect us. The horror lies not in their presence, but in the sudden realization that they were always there. Knowledge, once again, is not creation, it is exposure. The protagonist sees more than he was meant to, and the veil does not go back down. The epistemological framework of the story is inverted. Perception does not illuminate, it destroys. We must recognize what this implies. The horror is not in what is learned, but in what cannot be unlearned. Once the hidden world is glimpsed, the known world becomes a lie. This is the collapse Lovecraft describes, not of buildings, but of models of reality. In this way, Lovecraft's conception of forbidden knowledge is structurally different from classical myths of overreaching. In the story of Prometheus, fire is stolen from the gods, and humanity gains power. In the story of Faust, a pact is made in pursuit of mastery. But in Lovecraft, there is no theft, no bargain, no rebellion. There is only discovery without defense. The universe offers its truths without invitation, and the human mind is unequipped to handle them. The Shadow, Out of Time, presents this most tragically. Professor Peaslee believes he has suffered amnesia, only to uncover that he was psychically displaced into an alien civilization millions of years in the past. He pieces together the truth through archaeological investigation, and the knowledge he gains is complete, but it obliterates his identity. His dreams, his memory, his sense of self, all collapse beneath the weight of continuity that stretches beyond his species, beyond his time. Knowledge, in this case, is not power. It is erasure, not revelation, but recursion, not clarity, but contagion. Lovecraft constructs a universe in which knowledge behaves like an informational virus, capable of replication, mutation, and transmission. This is particularly evident in how forbidden knowledge spreads not just through books, but through dreams, whispers, and symbols. In The Thing on the Doorstep, 1937, the transmission of occult knowledge enables body swapping and possession across generations. In The Whisperer in Darkness, recordings and letters carry traces of alien contact that begin to infect the rational minds who engage with them. This strategy foreshadows what we now understand as mimetic horror, a structure where ideas themselves carry the contamination. Lovecraft intuited this before the language of mimetics existed, that some concepts are so destabilizing, so structurally incompatible with human cognition, that to think them is to be transformed by them. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's vision of truth. It is not benevolent, not even neutral. It is structurally predatory. Truth in his mythos does not wait to be discovered. It leaks, invades, beckons. It is never complete, but always enough to break the seal. Lovecraft's stories do not warn against curiosity. They document its failure. His characters are scholars, readers, seekers, but they are also victims of exposure. The epistemic collapse they experience is not dramatic. It is slow, bureaucratic, textual. It comes in the form of footnotes, glyphs, testimonies. The horror is not in what they find, but in their realization that the act of finding is itself the fatal error. Before the term Cthulhu mythos was ever coined, before Lovecraft's creations became the basis for an entire subgenre of cosmic horror, his hidden worlds began to emerge in fragments, oblique references, dream-inspired scenes, and disconnected horrors that hinted at something far larger. These early appearances do not form a cohesive mythology, but rather a lattice of suggestive connections. They mark the genesis of Lovecraft's intertextual architecture, where stories are less about self-contained plots and more about cumulative implication. In these works, the reader encounters whispers of names, glimpses of ruins, fragments of language, each acting as an archaeological shard pointing toward a larger, invisible structure beneath the surface of narrative. One of the earliest of these foundational stories is The Nameless City, 1921, often regarded as Lovecraft's first significant step toward myth building. The narrator ventures into ancient ruins in the Arabian desert, structures that predate human civilization, filled with strange inscriptions and architecture unsuited for human proportions. The city's inhabitants, described only as reptilian and vaguely humanoid, are never fully seen. The narrator descends deeper, experiencing a vision of the city as it once was, inhabited by these beings. He reflects, that is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die. This now iconic couplet, later attributed to the Necronomicon, is Lovecraft's first articulation of non-linear temporality, a key theme of his mythos. Importantly, The Nameless City introduces not just an ancient race, but the idea of knowledge as haunting, that ancient truths do not simply remain buried, but linger, wait, and eventually press into the present. Another early glimpse appears in The Statement of Randolph Carter, 1919, which functions less as a mythological exposition and more as a frame for epistemic horror. The story is a monologue given by Carter, a recurring character in Lovecraft's fiction, as he recounts an occult experiment gone wrong. His friend, Harley Warren, descends into a crypt in search of forbidden texts and ancient truths, communicating via telephone until his final ambiguous message, "You fool, Warren is dead." The horror here is suggestive, never resolved. What lies beneath the crypt is never named, never described, only implied through Carter's mental disintegration. This story establishes a narrative technique Lovecraft will refine throughout his career. withholding the full image in favor of reaction and effect. We never see the creature or force. We see the aftermath, the madness, the loss. This becomes a structural motif throughout his work. Truth is never presented directly, but through fracture. Even in these early tales, Lovecraft begins constructing a shared world without announcing it as such. Characters, locations, and texts begin to recur, subtly at first, but increasingly with purpose. The city of Arkham, for example, makes its debut in The Picture in the House, 1920, a short story where the horror is domestic and cannibalistic, but the setting becomes essential. Arkham soon reappears in The Dunwich Horror, The Thing on the Doorstep, and The Color Out of Space. Similarly, the fictional Miskatonic University, introduced in Herbert West, Reanimator, 1922, becomes a central hub for scholarly references, forbidden tomes, and scientific overreach. These fictional constructs function not merely as settings, but as narrative connectors, granting each story a fragment of shared ontology. We must recognize that these early intertextual references are not about continuity in the modern franchise sense. Lovecraft was not building a systematic universe with rules and timelines. Instead, he was simulating historical depth. The repeated mention of certain texts, the Necronomicon, the Book of Iban, the Pnakotic manuscripts, suggests not coordination, but accumulation. The more frequently these texts are cited, the more real they begin to feel. And yet, none of them is ever fully quoted or summarized. Their power lies in absence. They are lacunary artifacts, mentioned, feared, invoked, but never revealed in their entirety. This strategy creates the illusion of a larger mythos that exists beyond the page, into which each story opens only a partial view. One of Lovecraft's earliest and most subtle world-building techniques appears in his manipulation of names. The names of deities and beings, Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, Azathoth, appear early, sometimes only in passing, yet carry semantic weight far beyond their context. In The Festival, 1923, for instance, the narrator visits a forgotten town and is led into subterranean caverns where grotesque rites are performed. The climax references Yog-Sothoth, but without explanation. This name functions as both lure and wall, inviting speculation while defying comprehension. The story ends not with resolution, but with institutionalization. The narrator is deemed mad, though we are left to wonder if his madness is not the result of delusion, but of true perception, not plot, but pattern, not characters, but continuity. These early stories do not operate in isolation, nor do they depend on mythological exposition. Rather, they offer echoes, shared phrases, consistent geographies, recurrent symbols. This repetition is not redundancy, but ritual. Lovecraft uses it to mimic the rhythms of oral tradition, where truth is passed not through logical narrative, but through recurrence and reverence. The hidden world emerges not in any single story, but across stories, through accumulation, resonance, and fragment. What begins as a disconnected series of tales slowly coheres into something larger, darker, and more architecturally precise, when At the Mountains of Madness was first serialized in 1936. It stood apart from everything Lovecraft had written before. Gone were the brief, fragmented glimpses of the unknown, replaced by a slow, methodical chronicle of discovery. The story reads not as Gothic fiction, but as scientific reportage. Its protagonist, Professor William Dyer of Miskatonic University, documents an Antarctic expedition intended to advance geological knowledge. But what begins as a rational endeavor descends into ontological panic. Through its structure and tone, the story transforms exploration into excavation of the earth, of civilization, and of the human mind itself. Each layer of ice and stone conceals not fossils, but predecessors, and the deeper Dyer digs, the more he unearths the ruin of human exceptionalism. The story's realism is its first weapon. Lovecraft fills the opening chapters with meticulous scientific language, discussions of core samples, air pressure, rock composition, and fossilized vegetation. This precision anchors the tale in the contemporary discourse of Antarctic exploration, a mirror of the real-world bird expeditions of the 1930s. But this realism serves a sinister purpose. It legitimizes the impossible. When Dyer's team discovers a line of strange barrel-shaped fossils with 5 rayed appendages, the description reads like a laboratory report: 6 feet end to end, 3 5/10 feet central diameter, bodies conical above and below. Yet as the analysis continues, the tone shifts from curiosity to unease. These are not fossils. They are corpses, perfectly preserved and biologically inexplicable. The transition from specimen to subject marks the story's pivot from science to revelation, and from knowledge to collapse. Consider carefully how Lovecraft orchestrates this descent. The narrative moves through a pattern of empirical discovery, interpretation, and failure. The scientists name the creatures elder things, believing them to be intelligent but extinct. Their art, murals etched upon the walls of their buried city, tells a story of creation, evolution, and rebellion. Dyer and his assistant Danforth interpret these carvings as a kind of prehistoric record, a visual autobiography of a race that colonized the young earth, created life accidentally, and then fell to their own biological inventions, the Shoggoths. It was under the sea at first, Dyer records, but when the land rose, it was reshaped, and the older things came up from the waters to dwell on the shores. The grandeur of these images lulls both reader and scientist into a false sense of comprehension. We believe for a moment that we are learning, but Lovecraft's irony is merciless. Comprehension itself is the trap. The Shoggoths, the protean, formless slaves of the elder things, embody Lovecraft's principle of entropy as revolt. They were created to labor, to shape cities, and to serve their masters. Yet in the mural sequence, the explorers see depictions of rebellion. The great black slimy things, bubbling and gurgling, the elder things fleeing before their shapeless creations. These images prefigure the expedition's own fate. The final surviving Shoggoths are still active beneath the Antarctic ice, mimicking voices, forming eyes, learning. Tekelili, Tekelili, they scream, a cry borrowed from Poe's The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, merging 2 centuries of literary descent. Through them, Lovecraft fuses biological evolution with linguistic contagion. The Shoggoth's imitation of human speech is not communication, but mockery, the echo of intelligence without consciousness. Humanity, Lovecraft suggests, is not the pinnacle of creation, but the latest accident in an endless cycle of makers and made. We must recognize that At the Mountains of Madness is not just a story of discovery, but a metatextual commentary on knowledge itself. Dyer, the narrator, repeatedly warns his audience not to follow in his footsteps. I am forced into speech because men of science have refused to follow my advice. His scientific tone masks terror. His insistence on empiricism collapsing under its own data. The story's structure, a report meant to dissuade further exploration, ironically functions as an invitation to curiosity. The reader, like Dyer's audience, becomes complicit in the same epistemic sin, the need to know. This recursive structure transforms the act of reading into a mirror of the act of discovery. We are warned against correlation, and yet we correlate. We dig, and the story digs with us. Not exploration, but exhumation. Not revelation, but recursion. The Antarctic landscape becomes a metaphor for the buried architecture of time, each layer revealing a civilization older than the last, until chronology itself becomes absurd. When Dyer and Danforth finally descend into the abyss beyond the Elder City, they glimpse murals that depict entities even older, the shapeless chaos of Azathoth and the formless dances of the void. Here, Lovecraft turns geology into theology. The frozen strata of the earth become the sediment of existence itself. The explorers' lanterns flicker over carvings that suggest the futility of progress, the inevitability of entropy. Their final flight from the Shoggoth is not triumph, but retreat, a retreat into ignorance, into the fragile safety of not knowing. I could not help feeling that they were evil things, mountains of madness whose farther slopes looked out over some accursed ultimate abyss. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's transformation of horror. At the mountains of madness, the monster is not the Shoggoth, nor the elder things, nor even the chaotic gods implied at the story's end. The true horror is recognition, the collapse of anthropocentrism under the weight of cosmic history, the discovery that Earth's civilization is a secondary inheritance built upon the ruins of something older and far greater, turns human history into mere geology. In this light, the story serves as the culmination of every earlier tale of ruins, languages, and forbidden texts. What once lurked beneath temples or in crypts is now revealed on a planetary scale. The hidden world is not local. It is planetary, stratigraphic, and recursive. If At the Mountains of Madness exposes the geological depth of Lovecraft's cosmic horror, The Shadow Out of Time, 1936, unearths its temporal dimension. It is a story of memory, identity, and intellectual intrusion, told not through confrontation with monstrous forms, but through a creeping awareness that the narrator's mind is no longer his own. Where the Antarctic tale unravels the myth of human supremacy in space, Shadow undermines our confidence in the stability of self through time. In doing so, Lovecraft constructs a story that transforms memory into a haunted landscape, thought into territory, and knowledge into a form of possession. This is not merely a tale of time travel. It is a philosophical treatise disguised as fiction, and one that redefines what it means to encounter the hidden world. The story begins with Nathaniel Wingate Peaslee, a professor at Miskatonic University, who suffers a sudden mental collapse in 1908 during a lecture. For 5 years, he acts as another person, studying ancient cultures, corresponding in foreign languages he had never learned, and exhibiting profound intelligence in fields he had never pursued. When his old personality returns, he recalls none of this period. Lovecraft presents this not as possession, but as displacement. Over the course of the story, Peaslee begins to uncover a terrifying possibility, that his mind had been exchanged with that of a member of the great race of Yith, a race of beings who, in order to escape extinction, developed the ability to send their consciousness through time to inhabit other organisms. This mental colonization is not invasive in the traditional sense. It is academic. The Yithians are not conquerors, but archivists. They collect data from all ages and species, building a vast subterranean library in the desert city of Pinacotis. The horror here is subtle, but devastating, to be known entirely, without permission, and to be used as a temporary vessel in a system of pure knowledge. Great was the rejoicing when my mind came back to the body I had left so long ago, writes Peasley, but the reader is left to question whether he ever fully returned. What does it mean to be oneself if the self is porous, transferable, and archival? Lovecraft's depiction of identity in this story reflects not individuality, but historicity. We are not who we think we are. We are entries in a larger catalogue, footnotes in a cosmic archive. Peasley's dreams and fragmentary memories begin to cohere into a pattern, visions of alien geometry, discussions with inhuman scholars, glimpses of futures and pasts not his own. Importantly, Lovecraft doesn't render these with surrealism or delirium. The language is precise, even clinical. The Yithian city is described with architectural specificity. The walls were of a jasper-like substance. The ceiling was domed, and from it were suspended many pendulum-like objects. This scientific tone does not comfort the reader. It unsettles. It implies authenticity, as though these memories are not fictional, but recovered. The use of recurring terms, like Cyclopean, antediluvian, non-Euclidean, reinforces the idea that what Peasley is recalling is not just dream, but recovered history, a reactivation of buried memory, the self, as ruin. This collapse between knowledge and experience culminates when Peasley joins an expedition to the Australian desert, searching for physical evidence of the Yithian civilization. The discovery of an underground vault, inscribed with markings he remembers from his visions, confirms the unthinkable. His memories are real. The vault matches his subconscious architecture. The ancient texts, once glimpsed in dreams, lie inscribed on stone walls. I shivered at the utter strangeness of what I saw, he confesses, though it was no more than I had dreamed. Here, Lovecraft reverses the logic of proof. Archaeology is not about discovery, but about validation of the subconscious. The ruins do not reveal, they confirm. The self is no longer reliable. Reality bends to dream, and memory becomes artifact. We must consider how the shadow out of time expands Lovecraft's vision of horror beyond flesh, violence, or monstrosity. There are no Shoggoths in this tale, no cults or rituals, only thought, memory, and proof. Yet it remains one of his most unsettling works. Why? Because it enacts the epistemological collapse we explored in part 2.4. The horror is not that time travel exists, but that we are already participants in a system of time so vast that agency is irrelevant. The Yithians catalog humanity not because we are important, but because we are data. And the ultimate irony is that Peasley, a scholar himself, understands. He does not deny his displacement, he contextualizes it. He becomes, in the end, a co-author of his own erasure, not madness, but recognition, not alienation, but inclusion in a larger intelligence. This story marks a shift in Lovecraft's narrative evolution. While earlier stories flirt with mythic creatures and ancient gods, the shadow, out of time, presents cosmic horror as bureaucratic, scholarly, and inevitable. The Yithians are not worshipped. They are archivists. The vault is not a tomb. It is a library. And the hidden world, so often portrayed in Lovecraft's earlier works as buried in stone or submerged in sea. Here resides in mind itself. It is not beneath the earth, but behind the eye. To recall is to participate. To read is to risk memory. Lovecraft did not live to see the full structure of what would later be called the Cthulhu mythos. He never formalized a pantheon, never charted a canonical cosmology, and never systematized the fragmentary allusions scattered throughout his work. Yet after his death in 1937, a growing circle of correspondents, admirers, and imitators would attempt to do precisely that. These later writers, most notably August Derleth, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, and eventually modern figures such as Ramsey Campbell and Caitlin R. Kiernan, did not merely continue Lovecraft's stories. They reinterpreted them, creating a shared literary mythology that both preserved and distorted the original vision. The result is paradoxical, a mythos that became more defined, more populated, and more codified, while losing some of the epistemic ambiguity and ontological disorientation that made Lovecraft's original stories so unsettling. The most significant figure in this transition was August Derleth, a friend, editor, and literary executor of Lovecraft's estate. Through his founding of Arkham House in 1939, Derleth ensured Lovecraft's works remained in print, but he also restructured the mythos to fit a dualistic moral framework. Derleth classified the cosmic entities into elder gods, benevolent or neutral beings, and great old ones, malevolent or destructive forces, effectively recasting Lovecraft's vision of amoral cosmicism into a theological drama. He also introduced the idea of elemental correspondences, assigning beings like Cthulhu to water, Hastur to air, and so on. This imposed order where Lovecraft had only implied chaos. The old ones were, the old ones are, and the old ones shall be, Derleth wrote, echoing but simplifying Lovecraft's famous phrase. In doing so, he shifted the mythos from ontological dread to a cosmic battleground. This was not continuity, but reinterpretation, turning unknowability into structure. Consider carefully what this means. Derleth's reinterpretation transformed the mythos into something narratively usable, a sandbox for new writers to explore. Stories could now be plotted around cults, alignments, and oppositions, but this also diluted the horror. Lovecraft's creatures were terrifying because they were not evil. They were beyond morality. Derleth's framework reintroduced human ethical categories into a mythos that was originally built to defy them. Nevertheless, without Derleth, it is likely that Lovecraft's stories would have vanished into obscurity. His structural revisionism, though philosophically misaligned, was a literary preservation effort, one that ensured the mythos would survive, albeit transformed. Other contemporaries of Lovecraft, particularly Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard, expanded the mythos laterally, adding new names, tomes, and entities while preserving Lovecraft's aura of antiquity and uncertainty. Smith's Zothique tales, for example, imagine a far future Earth steeped in necromantic decay, often referencing books like the Book of Ibon or gods like Tzatogoa, creations that Lovecraft would later adopt. Howard, best known for Conan the Barbarian, peppered his sword and sorcery world with mythos references, blending prehistory with pulp violence. These inclusions were not coordinated, rather, they emerged from a shared sense of literary inheritance, a belief that these stories occupied the same cosmological lattice, regardless of genre or tone. This interauthorial collaboration what Lovecraft once called literary revisionism in his letters, created a pseudo-historical tradition. The mythos came to resemble real-world mythologies, not because it was systematized, but because it was layered and contradictory. Just as the Greek myths have conflicting genealogies and overlapping narratives, so too does the Cthulhu mythos acquire a form of mythic realism through its internal inconsistency. The multiplicity of voices, each adding, revising, reinterpreting, mirrors the kind of organic development we associate with genuine cultural memory. Not clarity, but depth. Not precision, but density. The hidden world, once Lovecraft's private madness, became a public archive. In the second half of the 20th century, newer writers pushed the mythos in unexpected directions. Ramsey Campbell, often considered the finest post-Lovecraftian writer, relocated the mythos to the United Kingdom, introducing local gods and regional adaptations. His stories, such as Cold Print, 1969, treat the mythos not as canon, but as infectious metaphor. Likewise, T.E.D. Klein, in The Events at Porth Farm, 1972, explores how ancient forces seep into modern rural life, portraying the mythos as an ambient presence rather than an overt mythology. These writers return to Lovecraft's core principle, suggestion over declaration. They reintroduced ambiguity, often portraying the mythos as a psychological phenomenon rather than a literal pantheon of monsters. We must recognize how this gradual shift mirrors Lovecraft's own themes of contagion and recurrence. The mythos becomes a mimetic virus, adaptable to new regions, new eras, and new anxieties. In the hands of contemporary authors like Laird Barron or Caitlin R. Kiernan, Lovecraftian horror often emerges without tentacles, without tomes, only the sense of deep time vertigo, of ancient forces brushing against the membrane of the real. Kiernan's Houses Under the Sea, 2004, for example, reframes the Cthulhu cult as an elusive collective memory, transmitted through obsession and loss. These works do not expand the mythos, they erode its borders, returning it to a space of unknowability. This reveals something profound. Lovecraft's hidden world was never a finished map, but a method of seeing. While later writers constructed elaborate geographies and taxonomies, the most effective successes returned to fragmentation, recursion, and incompleteness. The power of the mythos lies not in its coherence, but in its implication. It is not a mythology to be mastered, but a mirror, reflecting our fear that reality is too large, too old, and too alien to ever be understood. The strangest chapter of Lovecraft's hidden world began not with his pen, but with what followed after, when his fictional universe began to blur into belief. Unlike other literary creations confined to their pages, the Cthulhu mythos crossed a threshold, from fiction into urban legend, from crafted narrative into cultural mythos. What makes this transformation so unnerving is not that people believed in Cthulhu or the Necronomicon as literal truths, but that they behaved as if they might be. The mythos entered the domain of the hoax, the fringe cult, the internet rumor, and the dream journal. It mutated, it persisted, and in doing so, it demonstrated that Lovecraft had not merely written horror stories. He had authored a set of epistemic viruses that continued to propagate long after his death. Perhaps the most famous example is the persistent myth of the Necronomicon, the fictional grimoire invented by Lovecraft and attributed to the mad Arab Abdul al-Azred. Intended by the author as a parody of occult books, it soon took on a life of its own. In the 1970s, multiple editions of the Necronomicon appeared in occult bookstores, presented as real translations. The most notorious of these is the so-called Simon Necronomicon, 1977, which borrowed from Sumerian and Babylonian mythology to lend the book an air of ancient credibility, despite, or perhaps because of, its spurious origins. It became a staple of magical subcultures. Rituals were conducted, warnings were issued, bookstores claimed it caused strange disturbances. That the book was a forgery was almost beside the point. The fiction had been naturalized, embedded in the very communities it once sought to satirize. We must recognize that this phenomenon is not unique to Lovecraft, but his case is especially resonant. Mythologies have always evolved through repetition, appropriation, and misreading. What distinguishes Lovecraft's mythos is that it was designed to mimic reality, structured like an archive, peopled with academics, laced with footnotes and invented texts. This mimetic design made it ideal for factual contamination. Readers encountered the mythos not as a myth, but as a discovered body of knowledge. The blurred boundaries invited participation. In online forums, particularly during the early days of the internet, stories began to circulate of strange dreams involving cyclopean cities or drowned stars. Websites claimed to locate Rolia via oceanographic coordinates. ARGs, alternate reality games, incorporated mythos elements, encouraging players to piece together scraps of forbidden lore. It is not that people believed in Cthulhu, but they acted as if the mythos had occupied the symbolic landscape of real folklore. One of the most intriguing developments in recent years has been the simulation of discovery. YouTube channels now present mockumentaries about Lovecraftian ruins found in Antarctica, often citing At the Mountains of Madness as if it were a redacted report. TikTok users post videos documenting Cthulhu dreams, claiming shared hallucinations of vast underwater cities. Reddit threads regularly analyze satellite images for impossible geometric patterns. These are not simply jokes. They are digital rituals, performed not to reveal belief, but to explore it. Like the medieval grimoires Lovecraft parodied, these new rituals blur performance and conviction. They function as participatory fiction, and their very ambiguity ensures the mythos continues to spread, not as narrative, but as atmosphere. This circular echo is especially evident in dream culture. Lovecraft's original stories frequently use dreams as narrative devices. Randolph Carter's Voyages, Wilcox's Cthulhu Dreams, Peasley's Yithian Memories. In return, readers began to report dreams of their own. Some are clearly inspired by the stories. Others seem to draw unconsciously on the symbolic architecture of the mythos. Ancient cities, non-Euclidean structures, submerged temples, voices echoing in untranslatable tongues. What emerges is not a fandom, but a folk tradition. The mythos has become a template through which people frame their own uncanny experiences, dreams, déjà vu, intrusive thoughts, feelings of cosmic insignificance. It is no longer merely a body of fiction. It is a repertoire, not belief, but resonance, not faith, but recurrence. The mythos functions not because people think it is real, but because it speaks to something psychologically real. Our fear of being watched by something that does not care. Our sense that history is deeper than we can grasp. Our intuition that meaning may not be intrinsic, but applied. The mythos persists because it offers a container for modern disquiet, a frame for the kinds of existential dread that traditional religion or folklore no longer address. Cthulhu is not a god to be worshipped, but a formless reflection of our most inarticulate fears. His cult is not organized, but diffuse. Dreamers, readers, posters, all orbiting the same symbolic gravity. This reveals something profound. Lovecraft's hidden world has escaped authorship. It no longer belongs to Lovecraft, or Derleth, or any single writer. It moves through culture like a mimetic haunting, surfacing in subcultures, digital performances, and misread texts. The line between fiction and folklore has dissolved, not because fiction has been forgotten, but because folklore has absorbed it. The mythos now occupies the same space as Slender Man, backrooms, and simulation theory, not in content, but in function. It explains without explaining. It frames the unframable. If Lovecraft's fiction is fundamentally about the collapse of human categories, of knowledge, sanity, language, and time, then its translation into other media has always posed a paradox. How does one represent the unrepresentable? His prose thrives on implication, on the withheld image, on the blasphemous geometry and indescribable textures that defy visual form. And yet, for over a century, artists, filmmakers, musicians, and game designers have attempted to adapt the mythos into forms that are necessarily sensory, literal, and immediate. This tension between the unknowable and the visualized, the silent and the scored, has given rise to a rich field of interpretation. Some adaptations attempt fidelity, others abstraction. All grapple with the same dilemma, not how to show Lovecraft's hidden world, but how to suggest it without reducing it. Film, inevitably, has served as a primary medium for Lovecraftian adaptation, but rarely in direct terms. Few major studios have attempted straightforward versions of his stories, and for good reason. At the Mountains of Madness, The Shadow Out of Time, and The Call of Cthulhu lack traditional arcs, climaxes, or resolutions. Instead, Lovecraft's influence is most powerfully felt in atmospheric horror, films that emphasize dread, isolation, and cosmic destabilization. John Carpenter's The Thing, 1982, often cited as a quintessential Lovecraftian film, is not an adaptation per se, but a thematic mirror. Its Antarctic setting, shape-shifting creature, an emphasis on epistemic paranoia, echo mountains almost directly. The creature cannot be understood, only feared. "I don't know what it is," one character mutters, "but it's weird and pissed off, whatever it is." The ambiguity is the point. The monster is not a villain, but a breakdown in ontology. Other films adopt Lovecraft's tone more than his mythology. Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker, 1979, Alex Garland's Annihilation, 2018, and Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead's The Endless, 2017, all feature unknowable zones, recursive time structures, and encounters that fracture the self. These films do not mention Cthulhu or Yithians, but they perform Lovecraftian horror through pacing, silence, and dissolution. In Annihilation, characters enter a quarantined landscape where biology and identity are restructured. One character's final transformation into a shimmering humanoid mirror offers no clear meaning. It does not attack, it mimics. And the horror is not in pain, but in losing the boundary of self. The influence is structural. These films turn science fiction into philosophical confrontation, using Lovecraft's central premise, that to understand the universe is to dissolve within it. Video games have emerged as perhaps the most effective platform for Lovecraftian adaptation, in part because they allow for experiential horror. Titles like Bloodborne, 2015, Call of Cthulhu, 2018, and The Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, 2002, immerse players in spaces where perception, memory, and agency become unstable. Bloodborne, players begin in a gothic nightmare of beasts and plague, only to uncover layers of cosmic horror beneath, alien gods, forgotten rituals, and dreams within dreams. The game doesn't tell the player it is Lovecraftian. It becomes Lovecraftian through gradual disorientation. Madness is not a cutscene, but a mechanic. The more insight the player accumulates, the more they see, the more they understand, and the more hostile the world becomes. This is Lovecraft's epistemic model rendered interactively. Knowledge is punishment. Call of Cthulhu, though more literal in its mythological references, incorporates sanity mechanics and detective gameplay that evoke the feeling of scholarly unraveling. The player investigates, connects documents, uncovers truths, and is gradually overwhelmed. Here again, horror arises not from jump scares, but from cognitive excess. The story warns, as Lovecraft did, that to learn too much is to lose the self. Similarly, Amnesia, The Dark Descent, 2010, strips the player of combat ability and immerses them in an environment of darkness, memory loss, and unknowable threat. The mind becomes the battleground. What is terrifying is not the monster, but the inability to remember whether it was ever real. In music, the mythos has found strange resonance in genres that value atmosphere, repetition, and symbolic obscurity. Black metal, particularly in its atmospheric and ritualistic subgenres, often draws on Lovecraftian motifs. Bands like Portal, The Great Old Ones, and Yog-Sothoth use dissonant textures, unreadable lyrics, and occult imagery to evoke a sense of cosmic vastness. These songs are not narratives, but soundscapes of incomprehension. Their structures resist traditional song form, opting instead for spirals, drones, and bursts of noise. Like the mythos itself, the music withholds resolution. Likewise, dark ambient and drone composers, such as Lustmord or Atrium Carcere, craft albums that resemble field recordings from derelict temples, submerged tombs, or dream ruins. These tracks do not entertain. They immerse. They invite the listener not into rhythm, but into ritual space. We must pause to consider why the mythos persists so powerfully across media. It is not simply because Lovecraft created compelling monsters or stories. It is because he offered a structure of feeling, a template for expressing the sublime in a disenchanted age. His works provide the symbolic vocabulary for experiences that modernity cannot explain. Dread without object, awe without deity, collapse without warning. In this sense, adaptations need not quote the mythos directly to be Lovecraftian. They only need to replicate the vertigo of encountering something older than time, greater than meaning, and already watching. This reveals something profound. Lovecraft's hidden world cannot be adapted faithfully in the traditional sense, because it was never stable to begin with. The most effective adaptations do not reproduce the mythos. They interpret its function. They make us feel small, uncertain, unmoored. They turn narrative into architecture, gameplay into inquiry, sound into invocation. The hidden world persists not because it is seen, but because it is sensed across screens, stages, and speakers. Lovecraft's work, once dismissed as pulp sensationalism, has undergone one of the most remarkable transformations in modern literary history. What began as tales published in Weird Tales, cheap, ephemeral magazines for a niche audience, has become a subject of serious academic study and a foundational mythos for entire subcultures. In the decades since his death, Lovecraft has moved from the fringe of popular imagination into the center of cultural theory, artistic experimentation, and alternative spirituality. Yet this ascent has not diluted his mystery. Rather, it has expanded his reach, proving that the mythos operates not only as fiction, but as framework, a language for discussing the ineffable in an age increasingly defined by disillusionment. Scholars analyze it, musicians invoke it, magicians reinterpret it. The hidden world has become a living discourse, simultaneously philosophical, aesthetic, and ritualistic. The academic rediscovery of Lovecraft began in earnest during the 1960s and 1970s, paralleling the rise of structuralism and postmodernism. Thinkers found in his work an unexpected resonance with contemporary theory. Where earlier readers saw monsters, later critics saw metaphors for meaning's collapse. Michel Houellebecq's H.P. Lovecraft, Against the World, Against Life, 1991, described him as a mystic of materialism, a writer whose cosmic nihilism served as both revolt and revelation. Later, philosophers like Graham Harman and Eugene Thacker reinterpreted the mythos through the lens of speculative realism and object-oriented ontology. For them, Lovecraft was not a fantasist, but a proto-metaphysician, one who articulated the limits of human-centered thought. Thacker, in the Dust of This Planet, 2011, writes, "World without us is the real horror." In this reframing, Lovecraft becomes not a teller of ghost stories, but a prophet of the post-human condition, his ancient gods functioning as metaphors for a world indifferent to consciousness. Simultaneously, Lovecraft's imagery and mythology have been adopted, sometimes ironically, sometimes earnestly, by subcultural and occult movements. During the 1970s and 1980s, practitioners of chaos magic and modern occultism began incorporating Lovecraftian symbols into their rituals. For these groups, the great old ones were not fictional entities, but metaphorical archetypes, forces of entropy, creation, and transformation. Writers like Kenneth Grant in The Magical Revival, 1972, and Outside the Circles of Time, 1980, treated Lovecraft's mythos as a form of unintentional revelation, suggesting that his fiction tapped into genuine pre-human currents of consciousness. Others, like the magicians of the Typhonian and esoteric order of Dagon traditions, blended Thelemic and Lovecraftian language, claiming the stories to be modern mythic transmissions rather than inventions. It is not belief that matters here, but performance. By acting as if the mythos were real, these practitioners reenact Lovecraft's own experiment in plausible fabrication. The fiction becomes ritual, the ritual becomes myth. In academic and cultural theory, Lovecraft's work has also become a lens for examining race, colonialism, and the othering gaze. His personal racism, explicit in his letters and stories, has prompted deep critical re-evaluations. Scholars such as Kinitra Brooks and Paul Lafarge have explored how Lovecraft's fear of the other manifests as cosmic alienation, where the monstrous represents both racial anxiety and existential dread. In this reading, the hidden world doubles as a mirror for modernity's own contradictions, an enlightened society terrified of its own darkness. Yet contemporary authors of color, like Victor Laval, The Ballad of Black Tom, 2016, and Matt Ruff, Lovecraft Country, 2016, have reclaimed his mythos to expose and subvert these racial undercurrents. Their works transform Lovecraft's fear of contamination into a reclamation of voice, showing that horror can also be resistance. This dual inheritance, revulsion, and reimagining ensures that Lovecraft remains culturally active, not merely studied, but contested. Beyond academia and literature, the mythos has permeated the digital subcultures of the internet. Online forums, Reddit communities, and image boards have adopted Lovecraftian concepts as shorthand for the uncanny. Memes of Cthulhu, as both cosmic god and comedic mascot, circulate side by side, reflecting the dual impulse of awe and irony that defines modern engagement with myth. Websites like the SCP Foundation, a collaborative fiction project documenting anomalous phenomena, explicitly draw upon Lovecraftian themes: containment, incomprehension, bureaucratic horror. These spaces transform the mythos into a collective storytelling engine where thousands of anonymous participants build upon shared tropes, much like the pulp writers of the 1930s. It is myth-making at scale, crowdsourced and recursive, a fitting continuation of Lovecraft's fragmented, intertextual legacy. We must recognize how academia and subculture converge here. Both approach the mythos as a field of inquiry rather than a fixed text. Scholars interrogate its philosophical and historical meanings. Fans and practitioners embody it through creativity, ritual, and play. The result is a feedback loop between analysis and performance. Conferences cite fan art. Fan forums quote Deleuze. The mythos, once a solitary man's vision of cosmic despair, has become a shared intellectual and emotional commons, a living artifact of human confrontation with the unknowable. This recursion mirrors Lovecraft's own narrative structures, where each discovery leads not to closure, but to broader contagion. Knowledge spreads, so does interpretation. Both are irreversible. This reveals something profound. The hidden world has always been more than an imagined place. It is a method of perception. In academia, it becomes philosophy. In subculture, ritual. In fandom, creativity. Each sphere appropriates Lovecraft not to worship his cosmos, but to navigate its implications. His mythos persists because it provides a language for what remains unspeakable: dread, vastness, awe. It is not belief that keeps the mythos alive, but inquiry. And the more we inquire, the more the line between fiction and philosophy dissolves. When readers speak of being haunted by Lovecraft, they are rarely referring to his plots. The architecture of a typical Lovecraft story, discovery, descent, revelation, collapse, is structurally simple. What lingers, however, is the conceptual residue, the lingering unease that reality is not only larger than we imagined, but entirely indifferent to our imagining. Unlike traditional horror, which may terrify and then resolve, Lovecraft's work unsettles the reader in ways that continue after the story ends. His stories do not conclude. They suggest that everything we thought was secure, our mind, our world, our history, has already been breached. His most enduring contribution is not Cthulhu or the Necronomicon or any particular narrative, but a mode of perception, a way of seeing the universe that transforms existential dread into a kind of philosophical condition. Once glimpsed, it cannot be unglimpsed. This psychological signature is most evident in Lovecraft's treatment of scale. His hidden world is not hidden because it is locked away, but because it is too large to see all at once. His protagonists are often educated, rational men, scholars, linguists, scientists, who are slowly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they uncover. The threat is not violence or pursuit, but comprehension. To truly understand the mythos is to displace the self. The most merciful thing in the world, writes the narrator in The Call of Cthulhu, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. This is not simply a narrative hook. It is a diagnosis. The human mind does not go mad from illusion. It goes mad from coherence, from seeing how the fragments fit together and realizing they outline something that should not exist. We must recognize that this is not mere literary device. It mirrors the insights of modern science and post-human philosophy, which increasingly paint a picture of the universe as impersonal, dissented, and chaotic. From quantum indeterminacy to the heat death of the cosmos, the emerging view of reality in the 20th and 21st centuries aligns disturbingly well with Lovecraft's vision, a cosmos that is not just without meaning, but structurally resistant to meaning. In this light, Lovecraft's stories become not escapist fantasy, but cognitive rehearsals for cosmic nihilism. They allow us to inhabit, if briefly, the psychological atmosphere of a universe that does not care and never did. The reader is asked not to defeat the monster, but to witness their own irrelevance. This is not to say that Lovecraft promotes despair. Paradoxically, his work often evokes something closer to awe, not religious awe, but a vertiginous sense of scale, of smallness, that is not humiliating, but clarifying. In confronting the vastness of his imagined cosmology, some readers report a kind of quiet liberation. Freed from anthropocentrism, they find a space to contemplate themselves not as special beings, but as momentary configurations in a much older, stranger world. This aligns with what modern psychologists have termed the overview effect, a cognitive shift reported by astronauts viewing Earth from space. It is the terror of perspective, followed by a restructuring of thought. Lovecraft's mythos may function similarly, not to terrify the reader into paralysis, but to reframe their existential position within a broader, more honest cosmos. Yet we must also confront the darker implications of this view. If the universe is devoid of moral structure, if knowledge corrodes the self, if time and identity are illusions, then what remains? Lovecraft does not answer. He offers no salvation, no redemptive arc, no narrative closure. His protagonists rarely survive intact. Their insights isolate them. In this way, the mythos becomes a metaphor not just for cosmic truth, but for the burden of knowing. To live in a Lovecraftian universe is to live after revelation, after the veil has lifted, when nothing familiar retains its form. This is the psychological haunt, that the mind, having glimpsed too much, cannot return to its previous dimensions. The horror is not in what is out there, but in the permanence of having once seen it. Not resolution, but reverberation. Not fear, but ontological vertigo. Lovecraft's hidden world is ultimately internal. It is a model of thought. His stories explore what happens when that model breaks, when thought confronts something it cannot integrate. In this sense, the mythos is not about gods or monsters, but about the fragility of meaning itself. It asks, what if all our systems, language, science, morality, memory, are local adaptations, useful but ultimately insufficient? What happens when we go beyond their protective reach? This reveals something profound. Lovecraft's greatest horror is not Cthulhu or Yog-Sothoth. It is the moment after understanding, the silence that follows, comprehension, the absence where purpose used to be. His fiction models the psychological state of post-metaphysical consciousness, when myth has collapsed, religion has receded, and the only thing left is the fact of existence, vast and unyielding. In this sense, the mythos is not a fictional cosmology, but a meditation on what happens when all cosmologies fail, and so we return to where we began. The hidden world is not under the sea or beyond the stars. It is within thought itself, folded into dreams, buried beneath language, nested inside memory. Lovecraft did not show us this world. He taught us to see it, and in doing so, marked us. The implications cannot be unthought. The world has not changed, but we, perhaps, have.